Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and we are continuing our series here of discussions on the four Gospels. It may actually end up patterning out into the three monotheisms. I think I may add a section once we get to the Gospels and discuss them. I may add a section covering Muhammad and his creation of the religion of Islam. So we'll get to that and just take it along and see how far the talks go. So thus far we have discussed Akhenaten and Gilgamesh and how both of them essentially represent terminal phenomena. They are end phase responses to the disintegrations of these ancient, dying, gigantic civilizations that have caused these men, Gilgamesh and Akhenaten, to kick into a sort of emergency stress reaction mode and turn away from their respective city-states of Uruk in the case of Gilgamesh, Thebes in the case of Akhenaten, and now, as we'll see with Moses, him turning away from the Egyptian state apparatus also. With Moses, though, we're looking at this is no longer terminal phenomena. I think with Moses and also Homer, who will come after him, we're looking at embryonic phenomena. We're looking at the foundation. These men are looking toward the rising sun. Moses faces east. His journey traverses from west to east toward the rising sun, but it also imitates the night sea journey of the sun when it sets in the west and goes underneath the world in these ancient cosmogonies, underneath the world from west to east and comes out on the eastern horizon. He sort of retraces that. And in a way, I think Hegel was right. History does move dialectically. With Gilgamesh, we have a sort of thesis there where Gilgamesh traverses the 12 signs of the zodiac, including the underworld signs. With Akhenaten, we have an antithesis there where Akhenaten rejects the underworld, rejects the cults of the dead, and is paving the way for the coming, what Julian Jaynes calls the breakdown of the bicameral mind and the stabilization of the ego and the rise of the transcendent Western self, the hard self, perhaps the toughest self ever created in history. With Moses now and the foundation of a whole new world cycle based on monotheism, the creation of a religion that is based now on a monotheistic, the monotheistic tendencies and the zealotry of Akhenaten with the retrieval of the night sea journey of Gilgamesh going underneath the world as Moses sort of, in a way, the journey through the wilderness recapitulates a lot of the imagery that you find in the Egyptian underworld books of the netherworld. If you look at the books of the netherworld, they describe the sun god Re journeying through deserts where the underwater Nile, the underworld Nile dries up and there's no water. People are dying. There's another passage where there are floods going on and people are drowning. It goes through all these various versions of hell that I think is very similar to what we find in the accounts of the life of Moses in Philo and in Josephus and in Exodus. Those are the main sources for the life of Moses, for what we know about him. And so what we have here, what we're going to have with the three monotheisms are three events: the Sinai event, the Christ event, and the event at the cave, which could also be viewed as sort of three transformations of the spirit. If we think of Nietzsche's three transformations of the spirit, where he talks about the spirit beginning as a camel that says, "Put a load on me," then faces the dragon, upon every scale of whose body is inscribed the words, "Thou shalt." That dragon has to be slain so that one becomes again as a child. So you move from the camel to the dragon to the child. Here, I think with the three monotheisms, we move from the donkey to the lamb to the camel. So these are the three transformations of the monotheistic world that we're going to start moving into here. So with Moses, the first point to note is that his name is Egyptian. Moses is an Egyptian name meaning child born of. So it's a suffix that's missing a prefix. All the Egyptian versions of this name that we have, Re Mosa, Ka Mosa. Ramses actually means the child born of the sun god Re. Re Moses, he is the child born of the sun god Re. And so there's a missing prefix there that should be affixed to Moses' name, which is interesting given the aniconic nature of the world that he's going to found here, that there's no God there. There's a semiotic vacancy right in front of his name. There's a folk etymology, though, a Hebrew folk etymology, that traces his name to the word masha, which means to draw forth, especially to draw forth from the waters, which might refer to his infancy narrative where he's drawn forth from the Nile, but it could also refer to the process of him going back into Egypt and drawing forth the Hebrews from the waters of the Red Sea. So it's a descent into the underworld to get what has been forgotten and left behind there and to bring it up to create a new clearing, a new civilizational Lichtang, or clearing, within which new phenomena can begin to take place. So the life that we have of him, we know very little about him, actually. The infancy narrative simply has him, his parents are Hebrews who have heard that Pharaoh is not too happy with the Hebraic populations multiplying so rapidly that he has decided to have all the firstborn killed. So they put the infant Moses into the water, and he goes downstream in a little ark, a little miniature ark. And indeed, the same word is used to describe Noah's Ark as is used here in this little miniature ark that he's floating along in. And he's found by Pharaoh's daughter, who's out one day wandering. She finds him, draws him forth from the water, and he's raised as an Egyptian, although he's a Jew. And so we also know that we don't know much else about his childhood, but we do know that later he seems to have been educated as a priest at Heliopolis, which was a city known as On, O-N. And we remember from Akhenaten that Akhenaten also trained in the city of Heliopolis, which was the city that was sacred to the great sun god Re-Harakti, Re, the horse of the horizon. So he knew about Egyptian theology, he knew about it very well. And the narrative simply picks up with him sort of in medias res, with him one day wandering out of the temple and seeing a Jew being beaten by an Egyptian, and he kills the Egyptian in some accounts. Not in Josephus's account, though. Josephus tries to clean him up. Josephus gets rid of the shadow side of Moses, the side that's associated with the rage aspects of him. He kind of sanitizes Moses, and he simply has Moses fleeing from Egypt because Pharaoh is getting paranoid that he may have kingly ambitions. So he flees out into the deserts, winds up in Midian, somewhere out in the Sinai Peninsula there on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba. And the Midianites indeed may be Arabs, we're not sure, but he sort of undergoes a personal mini exodus there, winds up there with Jethro, marries his daughter, a woman named Zipporah, and has two sons, Gershom and Eliezer. I forget the name of the second son. But lives out there as a shepherd, basically, for 40 years. And it may be, and it was Freud's thesis, that Jethro is the one who introduced him to the religion of Yahweh, this Midianite volcano god, perhaps, or perhaps he has heard echoes of the Atum cult, and the war, Akhenaten's war against polytheism, may have come down the generations. The Exodus event, which he's about to undertake here, but let's interject just a moment here. The Exodus event seems to have taken place probably most likely around 1250 BC, about the same time as the Trojan War is also going on. There's a lot of chaos going on here at this time. We have the inscription of Ramses II as the great pharaoh who rules for almost the entirety of the 13th century, 1279 to 1213. Very long reign. And his son Merneptah has an inscription that dates from 1207 that says, that's already referring to the Israelites as a people but not a country. So we already know that they're floating around somewhere there. So 1207 is already too late. So it must be something earlier than that. Traditionally ascribed to the reign of Ramses II. Most likely that's when it occurred. It's said that Pharaoh's son dies. We know that Ramses, in the 20th year of his reign, had a son that died. It's most likely him, and it most likely took place right in there. There have been references to the Habiru in the Amarna letters of Akhenaten, and also Joshua. Joshua is referenced for the first time as Yeshua, a character who also occurs in the Amarna letters, which suggests, as T.J. Meek in his wonderful book about the Exodus wrote, that there may have been a couple of different waves going on here. We have the Habiru, possibly led by Joshua in the time of Akhenaten, undertaking a series of conquests in the north, centered around Shechem, which may have been the capital of what later became Israel. So Israel is being worked out by Joshua, who lived perhaps a century before Moses, and then Moses comes up from the south with the Exodus proper, bringing the Levites with him, and the Levites are the only ones who carry Egyptian names, not just Moses, but there are some other Egyptian names amongst the Levites. And they bring that cult in up from the south and conquer Debir and Hebron and go up through that way, and then eventually fuse together so that they form the basis of Judah, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Once again, we have a world of two lands here, as we did with Egypt, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. So we've got the two lands. So Moses has a theophany. He's out at the top of Mount Hebron, which is Sinai, and he's up there wandering around, apparently, when he sees the burning bush. So this bush is on fire, and he hears it talking to him, and a voice tells him, you need to go back and get your people out of Egypt. They're languishing there. Go back and get them out. And Moses demurs and says, well, I have a speech impediment. Pharaoh's not going to pay any. What good am I against Pharaoh? I'm just one man. And Yahweh says, we'll send your brother. Aaron will go with you. He'll do the talking for you. Don't worry about that. So Moses, interestingly enough, I think it's interesting that he has a speech impediment, and he's the founder of the alphabetic tradition of Judaism. I find that to be very interesting. So what he's going to have to do is he's got to go back to Egypt, descend back down into the underworld, and pull the Jews out in a way that's similar to the theology, let's say, of the Manichaean myth, where light has fallen into darkness and it's encapsulated and trapped in matter, and we are engaged in a process of restoration, of redemption and rescuing of all the light particles so that we can rebuild the original suit of light, the armor of light, worn by the primal man, the Anthropos, who wore it and had it torn off of him by the demons of darkness in his descent into the world of physicality, physical matter. I find that very interesting, this sort of the Jews languishing in the underworld of Egypt. And here, Egypt is this vast, cosmopolitan, decadent, dying place that I think that the Hebrews associated with. There's definite polyphobia here. There's no question about this polyphobic motif that runs all the way through the Old Testament, all the way down into the New Testament. There's a continual fear of big cities demonstrated. These religions, the monotheisms, are founded by nomads. These are desert dwellers. It's already prefigured with Enkidu, Gilgamesh's friend, who comes in like one of these guys, a dusty, shambling Martu who comes in from the desert and actually points toward the future of the founding of the monotheisms by nomads. These are desert-dwelling nomads moving across Deluz and Guattari's smooth space, encountering cities as striated spaces that are obstacles in their paths that they simply mow over and wipe out. There's a definite polyphobia here. The Tower of Babel, for instance, is basically a Rube's image of a ziggurat, as Joseph Campbell pointed out. It's a caricature of a ziggurat from the point of view of an unsophisticated donkey riding or camel riding folk. So make no mistake about that. This is a definite reaction against the Egyptian state as a cosmopolis, as a decadent place. Same thing that we find in the accounts in the book of Genesis with Abraham and the cities of the plain with Sodom and Gomorrah, which are also cosmopolitan, decadent places that have to be wiped out for their sexual depravities, that the Hebrews associated with places like this, and that we saw also turn Gilgamesh off with the cult of Ishtar, the sexual religious cult of Ishtar that completely turned Gilgamesh off and turned him away from the city and sent him out on a quest. So he asks the burning bush, what am I going to tell them your name is when I get there? And the bush replies to him, I am the I am. Aya Ashir Aya. That's what he tells Moses as his identity. I am. In other words, Yahweh simply is. Moses does. Moses carries out Yahweh's will. He is the one who Mashah draws forth. And so that's what he's going to do. So he suits up in a little caravan with his brother Aaron and the sons, and they're probably a whole tribe, and they head back into Egypt. He confronts Pharaoh. Then we have the scene with the staff where he tries to impress Pharaoh's court by throwing the staff on the ground that turns into a snake. And they're not impressed in the slightest bit with this rube from the hills coming back. Yahweh has told Moses to tell Pharaoh to request a 3-day sojourn for his people so they can go out in the desert and worship their God for 3 days and see if he'll buy that. Pharaoh doesn't. He hardens his heart famously, and we get the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues very much read like basically a folding in of Mesopotamian lamentation literature. The Mesopotamians, the Sumerians in particular, have lots of lamentation literature. The Lamentations of Ur, for instance, is one of them. The epic known as Era and Isham, in which all sorts of plagues are sent, and they're always depicting cities being torn apart, dismantled, and destroyed. All of that gets folded in here. That genre, I think the Hebrew authors here, and this is all being written down in the 8th century, about the same time as Homer, 750 BC, with the J text being written by someone in the southern kingdom of Judah, and the E text being written by someone in the northern kingdom of Israel, and then a priestly text. All this is being written down and will be redacted together around 700 BC, these 3 different versions of all of this. So they're not impressed. We get 10 plagues. In the J and the E and the P texts, by the way, the plagues were 7 plagues each. And apparently the editor, the redactor, came along and rounded them off to 10, perhaps to echo the Decalogue, perhaps to provide a sort of mirror image of the Decalogue, where the Decalogue is the creative metaphysical immune system that's specifically designed to protect a people from these kinds of disasters that befall Pharaoh here. So finally, they let the Hebrews go. They've had enough. The Pharaoh, probably Ramses II, loses his son. That's it. That's enough. Go away. So they leave a huge contingent, a massive migration that wanders out. And then Pharaoh suddenly, I guess, has a change of heart and decides to pursue them. So he chases after them. They get to the Red Sea. Scholars say that this is a mistranslation for Reed Sea. Either way, we don't know exactly what it's referring to, but it's a large body of water that they go into, and Yahweh tells Moses to raise his staff. He does so, and the waters part. It's a birth canal, basically, that they're going through. It's a vaginal image of going through the birth canal, an entire people that is coming into being and is being born. Note that we have with Egypt at this time, Egypt is giving birth, its internal Jewish proletariat. That's an internal proletariat. Using Toynbee's term, where an internal proletariat is a group of people that is in a society but not of it. They have a different sign regime, an alien DNA, you might say. They're giving birth to this people. They're splitting off and to become an external proletariat. And at the same time, the sea peoples are migrating, coming in. They start slamming in right about this time, 1225 BC, somewhere in there. And that's a huge external proletariat that then slams into Egypt. And they are barely able to withstand the impacts of the sea peoples who go raiding all across Palestine. They destroy and wipe out the Mycenaeans. They wipe out the Hittites. Unbelievably, the Hittites were so tough that even the Egyptians couldn't beat them. But yet these sea peoples wiped them off the map. And then all the coastal cities, Ugarit is dismantled, and all the way down to the time of Ramses III, who is the last pharaoh to have to deal with them. In about 1184, he leaves a victory stele inscription saying that he settled these populations and they are not a problem anymore. But Egypt is done. It's culturally exhausted in that process of staving off the sea peoples. So we have a lot of chaos going on here in the Eastern Mediterranean at this time. The Exodus and the Trojan War and the sea peoples all somehow seem to be entangled with the same chaos event. Something huge seems to have happened, probably a famine, agricultural failure, and a drought probably underlies all of this chaos that's going on. So the Exodus is taking place. Moses brings everyone out. He's cast in the role of Baal slaying Yam. Baal is the Canaanite thunder god who slays the dragon monster associated with the ocean called Yam, and he hurls a thunderbolt at it. In a similar way here, Moses is raising his staff, which is like Baal's thunderbolt, and Pharaoh is identified with the dragon, Yam, the dragon of the underworld that he is defeating, as the chaos monster that he's defeating, and they're moving out through this birth canal to become a new people. And so they wander for a while through the desert. And it takes them a while, but then their first test comes when they have to face the Amalekites. And they come to a place named Rephidim. Rephidim means support, and it apparently refers to the fact that Moses is very old by this point. He's like 80 years old, something like that. And he says every time he's looking out with Aaron and a man named Hur, they're looking out at the edge of a cliff over this battle that he has ordered Joshua to go and take the Hebrews into battle against the Amalekites here in some desert region. And every time he raises his staff, the Hebrews will be victorious. Every time he lowers his staff, the Amalekites will be victorious. So he has a guy on either side of him, Aaron and Hur. He's apparently too old to raise his hands on his own, and they raise the hands for him, one up, one down, or perhaps even both. But notice that he forms the letter Hey, which is the fifth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Hey, which is the letter E, which originated as a man with upraised arms, and according to Mark Allen Wachneen, symbolizes breath or a cry, or it actually literally means, hey, look at this. But it also has the connotation of the first breath that an infant takes when it comes into the world. Basically, I think that in forming the letter Hey here, the upside, the E on, the Greeks turn the E right side up as the letter epsilon. I think what we have is the Hebrews are forming themselves in their first jihad, their first holy war against the Amalekites as a nomadic war machine. They're coming into being now. They're like the infant that is breathing, coming into being and forming itself as a war machine. So they go through that, and then they're wandering through the desert for a while. They finally wind up in the region of Sinai. So we get the Sinai event where Moses goes up to the mountain. He probably had in his mind the Egyptian pyramid, spent his entire life in Egypt, very familiar with the pyramids. But whereas the pyramids were oriented toward, they were thanatological in significance, they were oriented toward the underworld. Here the underworld is what's being left behind. There's no interest in it. And when he ascends Mount Sinai, it tells him how to live. It gives him a decalogue. It's not thanatological in its significance, this meeting up this sort of miniature ziggurat / pyramid as this natural mountain that he finds, and he goes up and ascends and communes with God. And in the process, writes or receives the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and he goes down and he finds that the Hebrews have in the meanwhile resorted to the worship of a golden bull. He's very angry about this, smashes the Ten Commandments, smashes the bull, and orders that 3,000 of these worshippers of the golden bull be executed by his Levite Praetorian Guard, more or less. He's bringing in the Levites here. And Levite means serpent, by the way. It's associated with the cult of the snake, the serpent. It's connected with Leviathan. So they're bringing some sort of serpent cult with them from Egypt. We'll call his staff turning into a serpent. So this happens, and then it looks like the significance of the Decalogue is that the Hebrew mentality is remembering the invention of the alphabet. There is evidence that the Hebrews, or at least Canaanite workers, at a turquoise mine that's about 45 miles away from the Jebel Musa, that's the Arabic mountain of Moses, about 45 miles away from it, had a turquoise mine where we find the earliest alphabetic inscriptions dating from about the year 1800 BC from Semitic workers in these turquoise mines. And turquoise was sacred to the cow goddess Hathor, the goddess of the sky. Turquoise is blue, so it's associated with the sky. Hathor is the sky goddess. She's a cow, symbolized as a cow. And here we have the Egyptians who had a turquoise mine here going for a long, long time. And the Proto-Sinaitic alphabetic script, the earliest inscriptions are found there as graffiti carved on the walls by these slave workers. So indeed, the alphabet may have been born in the region of the Sinai. That's where the oldest inscriptions seem to date from, 1800 BC. And the myth seems to remember and recall that. Now, the Decalogue may, as Jonathan Kirsch remarks in his excellent biography of Moses, be actually the oldest text in the Bible. It may be the only thing actually written by Moses. It's very plausible, he thinks, if you understand it in the context of a tribal nomadic society in which, for example, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, actually refers to don't covet living in cities. Avoid cities, keep away from them. Thou shalt not kill actually doesn't mean not kill at all, but not pursue the tribal blood vendetta. Thou shalt not steal actually refers to don't steal each other's slaves. And give another example, thou shalt not take the Lord God's name in vain. In other words, don't use it for magical spells and incantations against other tribal enemies. So the Decalogue works very well as a memory of a tribal context. And so out of all this transformation, the Sinai event is the central religious event of Judaism. This is where Judaism comes into being, and now it begins to form an exoskeleton where the idea comes first. With religion always, it begins with a single idea, usually from one guy who has some sort of a theophany or a revelation, comes down, brings this image, and it becomes the DNA for the programming of cultural events, cultural software. Everything now needs to be physicalized. So they create the Ark of the Covenant, in which the Decalogue can be kept, and it becomes a kind of symbolic throne for Yahweh, which he can sit upon as they carry him with them on their wanderings through the desert. And they build the tabernacle, which is a sort of giant tent within which the ark is housed. And it's laid out, interestingly, on an east-west axis, exactly the way the Egyptians laid out their temples, facing the east. It's open toward the sun, as though Yahweh were a sun god, surrounded by the tents of the other tribes. And so it's a kind of similar, it's a kind of portable ziggurat, this tent that it's the best a nomadic grouping can come up with on a shoestring budget. So they go from there, and the journey continues. Lots of wandering, lots of complaining. The Hebrews begin troubling Moses. They're thirsty. There's no water. So he taps his staff on a rock, even though Yahweh tells him not to, and says, "Speak words to the rock." In other words, don't use magical incantations, because we're through with that stuff now. It's all about the word, the religion of the word, prayers. That God now has been translated into an aniconic, invisible entity that is to be carried in the mind and not represented in any kind of visual manifestation whatsoever. It's totally aniconic. So it carries that tendency over from Akhenaten's religion. So he defies Yahweh, uses his staff anyway to bring water out of the rocks for the thirsty Hebrews. And that invalidates him so that he's not allowed to go into the promised land, so that he's not allowed to get there. There's a number of other adventures, some of them pretty dark, which have to do with a secession that takes place amongst the Hebrews, a revolt led by a man named Korah, who sets up a revolt with 250 people when they're in the process of just moving into Canaan and beginning to conquer the towns and villages on the outer fringes of it. These guys don't want to do it, so they form a contingent led by Korah of 250 men who revolt against Moses, and Yahweh has bad things in store for them. He basically causes an earthquake to happen, which opens up the ground, and the 250 men drop down into it. In addition to that, another 14,000 have to be punished by being murdered and killed. It's a very severe religion here. This is Western monotheism. The West is based on religions of intense fury, wrath, rage, and zealotry. All of these guys. Moses having these people murdered. Anyone who disagrees with him amongst the other Jews have to be murdered. They're wiped out. We think of Akhenaten sending men with chisels forth across the land, erasing all the names of the gods. We think of Gilgamesh, completely pissed off by the ridiculous cult of Ishtar, this degenerate, corrupt cult of Ishtar that he turns away from and heads out in fury, determined to find immortality. Rage and the word is what all of this is about. And a religion based on the word. For the first time, nomads are usually illiterate, but for the first time, I think with the Hebrews, we get this singularity, this wonderful anomaly of literate nomads who invent a new script that's aniconic. It's a transformation of Egyptian hieroglyphs into these phonetic signifiers that divorce the mind from understanding everything in terms of pictographic images and so forth. It's a complete transformation that's going on here. And so Moses is not allowed entry into the promised land. Instead, Joshua is meant to lead the expedition across the Jordan River to bring down the walls of Jericho. And they're going to go in and wipe out Jericho and bring down its walls. Note that, too, when Gilgamesh returned from his quest to go and visit the flood hero Utnapishtim, he went back to Uruk there and demolished the walls of the city there and then rebuilt them. New cultic ideas demand new exteriorizations in physical time and space. And that's what's going on here. So Moses isn't allowed in. He gets a glimpse from Mount Pisgah looking out over Canaan, and he dies quietly somewhere under some tree. And we don't know where he's buried. He's specifically buried in an unmarked grave, so nobody would worship his bones as relics. And so the first of the great monotheistic religions that is still in the world today as a major player in the second generation of civilization that is coming into being here as an affiliation directly from the Egyptian civilization and also from the Mesopotamians, has now come into being and is up and fully running.